Hi everyone, welcome back to my Unique Creations tutorials. This time we're going to be finishing the Peacock Butterfly that we started in a previous video where we did all the ink fine liner outline. So today we're going to be working together to add all the colour with watercolours over the top of that ink work. So I'm going to take you through step by step how to do this, what colours to use, what techniques to use, what paintbrushes and paints. So join me, have fun, don't forget to like and share, subscribe to my channel, and then we can do lots more painting and drawing and illustrating together. So I hope you really enjoy this tutorial. Do let me know how you get on, and yeah, enjoy it, have fun. So I've already laid out our ink illustration for the Peacock Butterfly. This is the one that we did in a previous video, so I'll pop the link on here for you to follow along and have a go at doing before you start adding the watercolour. So now we're going to start adding some of the colours to the butterfly. So on my palette here I've already got a cadmium red, but you want a nice rich red colour. I've taken it straight from the half pan, transferred it onto my palette, and now I'm ready to go. By putting it onto your palette, you're able to then add water and slowly lighten the colour, but also thin it down a little bit. So if you don't want such a bright, vivid colour straight from the half pan, you can then thin it down. I'm using a number 2 paintbrush here. So it's still quite small, but it's a little bit larger than our 30, which we'll be using in a little while to add some more detail. So I'm going to go on in there and start adding in those red areas. So just off screen here, I have got the reference picture, and hopefully you have all got the reference photo to also be working from. And we can then start introducing some of the red into the key areas on the butterfly. Now, along here, I'm leaving this section because on the reference, you've got yellow and then white. So I don't want to obviously paint over those areas because otherwise it will disturb the colour and it'll be too dark then, and it'll just basically, if you put red underneath the yellow, it'll turn orange. So you want to avoid the areas that you don't want the red watercolour to be in. So I'm going to work my way around. I'm doing wet on dry here, and I'm doing it quite light to begin with. So this will enable me to kind of map in the key areas, and also I mean, because I'm not putting a huge amount of watercolour on the page, if you by chance put it in the wrong place, you can quite easily wet it and just dab the colour with a dry tissue and remove the colours so they're not in the wrong place. So I'm working my way around this section now, and you can see I've watered down that watercolour quite a lot, so it's fairly pale in colour, even slightly on the pink side. And I'm just popping in that red section here. And this is the first part. This is where the kind of different ochres and browns of the body will later come. So I'm just going up to the edge of there for now. So this area here is black on the reference photo, and this here is like a brown and white colour. So I want to come in here and add in the red on the base of this tail. Or it's not its tail, on the base of the wing, I should say, close to its tail. And we're just going to add in those areas along here. Just avoid the sections that we don't want to have red. And then I'm going to work my way over to this side for the wing. I'm allowing this to dry, and then I'm going to put a darker layer over the top. So looking back at your reference picture, you just want to fill in that red section. And we're going to work around here because this part here is black. So I'm going to work just underneath here, which is where that yellow and white section is on this part of the wing. So it kind of mirrors the opposing side. And work my way down here. Now on the reference picture, this bit here is like pink and white, so I'm going to avoid that because I don't want any of the red paint to go over that section. Work my way down, nice brush strokes, and then picking up a bit more paint, I'm going to fill in that section on the wing. Like so. So this is a great way of starting out to begin with, because you don't have to be too neat about it. You don't have to worry about too much detail at this stage. We are just mapping in where that red section is going to be, and then we're going to go back over it in a minute and make those colours a lot more vivid. The way in which I use watercolours is lots and lots of different layers, and that will become clear the more that we start to paint together. And then you can build up those layers, you can build up the textures, you can build up the different values in the colours. And then we've got this base section on this side of the tail. So I've just put a little bit more paint on my palette there because I was running out of the red. So I've just popped a little bit more on there. And now when I do the brush strokes on here, I don't want to paint a solid edge along this part here, because on the reference it kind of then blends into a brown section, or a browny kind of colour, brown and white along this edge. So if you leave a nice kind of feathered edge like so, and it's not just a solid line, you'll find then that later on when we start to blend it into the browns, that it will look a lot more realistic, and you won't have a big heavy harsh line between the two sections. So I'm now going to go back over the areas that I have previously put in, and I'm going to add a deeper shade of red here. And you can see it's going a lot more vivid in colour than when it originally went on. And that's for two reasons. One, because obviously we're layering now 2 layers of the same colour over one another, which will naturally make it look darker anyway. But also, where I've picked up a bit more paint from my half pan, it's making the actual pigment a lot stronger. So what I mean by that is I'll wet my half pan, load up my brush, transfer it onto my palette, and you can see how much brighter and more vivid the colour is, because obviously I'm getting a lot more pigment from the half pan and transferring it onto my palette. And rather than watering it down as much as I did before, I'm kind of using it as it is, so it will make the colour a lot more vibrant. And I'm going to slowly then start layering that up. And this is wet on dry technique. And we'll start layering that up over the top, slowly bringing that down into the areas that I want the red to be. So I'll work around that little pink and white section on here and start bringing it down. Now there should be a little white spot here. I've accidentally painted over it, so I'm going to work around where it should be, and then I'll show you how we'll take out some of that pink in a moment, and hopefully it'll lighten it back up again to the whiteness of the page underneath. So bringing that right down to the edge of the wing. Now I'm just dipping back in as I start to run out of paint on my brush, dip it back into the paint on the palette, reload it up, and layer those colours. And you can see the difference between here and here, how much more vivid the colour is now that we've put another layer over the top. So we're now going to work back over this section here. And again, it's that wet on dry technique. So applying wet paint over a dry surface, because the undertone colours have already dried now. Now this one I managed to do quite vivid anyway, so I won't need to do a huge amount more layering of colours. And then we'll work over onto this section of the wing. So start layering up those colours again. Now I'm running out of red on my palette, so I'm just going to pick up that half pan, that cadmium red. Load up my brush and then transfer the colour onto my palette again. There we go. And then I'm going to start reintroducing that onto this section. And you can see how much darker and brighter that colour is now. There we go. And just slowly but surely start to darken off that section on there. Always just mind as well, if the paint over here is still wet, just mind where you're resting your hand. So just take your time with it. The nice thing about following along with these videos is that at any point, if you wish to pause it, come back to it later, or if I'm painting a little bit fast, you want to just stop it for a while and catch up to where I am, you can. So it's a real nice bonus of being able to follow along at home by following the videos. So I'm going around that edge now, just being mindful of where the other colours need to come on the wing, so I'm avoiding those sections. There we go, and that starts to give us the base layer of that vivid red that the Peacock Butterfly has. And then if you need to go back over any other areas, you can, and layer those. And I think that's most of the red done. We're going to go in there with a little bit more detailing later, but we'll let those layers dry first. Now I mentioned that I painted over this section by accident, so hence why I said to you to map it in a very pale or very light colour to begin with. So what I can then do is I've cleaned my brush off and I've wiped off the excess water, and just with a damp brush I'm just going to agitate that paint on that surface. I don't want to flood it or anything like that with lots and lots of water. I just want to basically activate the paint that's on there, and then I'm going to get a little bit of tissue and just very gently press down, and hopefully, there we go, it started lifting that light colour off. Now this is hard to do if you've gone in very heavy to begin with lots of deep pigment, because obviously trying to remove that from the page is quite difficult. But there we go, that has lightened it considerably, so we can work with that later. So what we're going to now do is we're going to start layering up some of the brown areas and that on here, and also around this edge between the red and the brown we've got a kind of ochre colour, which is like a sort of mustardy yellow, and that's what we're going to add in first. It's even got a slight yellow tinge to it. So what I'm going to do is prepare my colours next. So I'm going to go in there with the yellow ochre, which is this mustardy brown colour. There we go, and pop some onto our palette. Clean off my brush, and I'm also going to put some yellow on there as well. So this is like a lemon yellow colour. I'm going to put that next to it to save some space on my palette for the other colours later. I'm not going to need a huge amount, and then just clean my brush off in between. So those colours are now ready to go. So what I'm going to do here is introduce some of the yellow first, and we're doing wet on dry technique again. So I'm going to start on this side, and I'm going to start by just adding some of that lemon yellow around the edge of the wing here. Now to begin with, this is going to look really bright. As we start introducing some of the brown tones over the top, it will start to mute it. So I'm going to add the yellow, and now I'm going to introduce some of the ochre. So I'm going to pop some of the ochre over the top here, and you can see how that ink works really well because it's coming through and you can see all that detailing even though we're putting the colours over the top. So what I'm doing here is just introducing the ochre to the closer to the body section of the actual butterfly. And this is now actually a wet on wet technique because this paint along here is still wet. As I then gently brush this ochre across over the yellow, because of the two colours are kind of starting to merge together. And then what I'm going to do is I've just cleaned my brush off and I'm just using just a slightly damp but clean brush. And you can see how I can then manipulate and move that colour over the top, so the ochre over the top of the yellow. And you see how it nicely blends the two colours together. We're now going to blend the red into the yellow. Now the way we do this is I've cleaned off my brush. I don't want it soaking wet because otherwise it will just make the colours too washed out, and it will also make the blending process really messy. So you just want a slightly damp brush. So I've washed my brush off, I've wiped it on the side of my water pot just to reduce the amount of water that's on there. And I'm very gently now, and this is the beauty of watercolours, because watercolours are non-permanent, and as soon as you put water on them they reactivate. What I'm now doing is reactivating that edge of the red colour, and I'm very gently now pulling that colour over the top of the yellow that I've just put in, and hopefully you'll see the same effect that is happening here, where those colours are now starting to blend together and merge. And all I'm doing is just using the colour I've got on the page and just blending them across like so. I'm going to bring that down. Now I've got a bit of red still on my brush because it's obviously picked up some of those pigments, and that works in my favour because I can then gently stipple it down the side of that part of the body. And then I'm going to do the same effect. So I've cleaned off my brush, wiped off the excess so it's just slightly damp, and I'm going to just agitate that paint along that edge right the way around where the red touches the yellow. And if you've got too much water, just dab your brush on your tissue and it will take away the excess paint that you've got, or the excess water that you've got on your brush. I'll put in the comment section as well, or in the caption section, the colours that we're using on this, and I'll also put on the size of brushes, and obviously you'll need your water pot, your palette and your tissue, so I'll list all that on there, so if you ever come back to this later and you want to know what materials you're going to need, everything will be listed on there for you. So don't forget to like and subscribe as well, and then you can follow along lots of other tutorials and have a go at home. So now that's activated, you can see how it's really blended those edges. Yeah, so we've gone from quite a harsh edge here, and now the colours are all starting to blend into one another. And we're going to layer more colours over the top of this, but I want it to dry first. So what I'm going to do is the same process on this side of the wing. So we start off with that yellow again. So I'm just going to wet that yellow and pop that. So this is your wet on dry, so we're not needing to wet the paper yet. We are just literally layering on that yellow underneath and bringing it right up to the edge of that red along here like so. I'm then going to pick up some of the yellow ochre. Just need to wet my brush there a little bit more. That's it, reactivate that paint, as it does start to dry out on your palette after a while, but by simply just adding a little bit of water it will then get that paint working again. And bringing it up to the edge of the body of that butterfly, and because we're working quite quickly, this yellow is still wet, which means that the ochre and the yellow are blending nicely together. Now, if you've taken a little bit longer to layer those colours up, it's not a problem. All you need to do is just wash your brush off, take off the excess water, and with a damp brush, just go between the two sections of colour and they will reactivate that paint and it will start blending it together for you. So I'm going to add a little bit more ochre along here. I want it a little darker. And then we're going to do the same process that we did previously on the body. So I've just lost my reference picture that I was working on. The joys that you have when you're working on with technology. There we go, I've got my picture back now. So I'm just going to use my damp brush and I'm going to blend this red into the yellow. So I've wet my brush, taken off the excess water, just very gently agitating that red, reactivating that sort of dry paint because it's obviously now dried on the page, and slowly pulling across some of that red onto the yellow. It'll start blending the two together for you. And then I'm going to do the same on this edge here. So agitate that paint, get it moving around. It'll soften those edges for you. Clean my brush off so it's nice and pigment free, so I've reduced the amount of pigment that's sat on my brush. And I'm just now working with a slightly damp brush and just moving that paint around to where I want it to be. So you end up with a lot more control over where the actual watercolours go. Something you often hear a lot of people say is that they can be quite unpredictable with watercolours, and they can, depending on the techniques you use. If you use layering techniques like this, you can control them a lot better. So you will be able to then decide where you actually want the paint to go, to a point obviously. There will be exceptions to the rule. So we've now got that blended effect between the sort of main centre body part of the actual butterfly and the wing, but I want to actually make this a little bit darker. So I'm going to now switch over to my 3-0 brush, which is a lot smaller, and I'm going to introduce another colour now. So I'll use my bigger brush just to transfer the colour. So this one here is a burnt umber. So it's a nice dark brown colour. So I'll activate that paint, transfer some over onto my palette. There we go. So it's a nice dark brown colour, and we're going to use this on quite a few different areas of the butterfly. There we go, that should do us for now. So I'm going to switch back to that 3-0 paintbrush, nice and small, and I'm going to use a stippling technique, which is basically where you just dab the brush up and down on the page, and it gives you a nice kind of dotted effect, and if you build that up it gives you quite a nice texture to the watercolour. So on the reference picture here, along the edge of the body is a lot darker and there's more of that brown happening. So you do want to make sure that the colour underneath is dry. So if it's still very wet from earlier on, let it dry first. And then what we're going to do is start layering up just in little dots. Now you don't want to totally saturate it with the dark brown colour. You want to still be able to see some of that undertone of the ochre coming through. So you can do that by just spacing out the dots. If you don't put them too close to each other, it will enable the colour underneath to come through. And I'm going to then slowly actually bring that down into the top of the red areas on the edge of that wing as well. And it will give you a really lovely textured effect, very similar to how the actual image looks like in the for the reference image. So it gives you a really lovely texture mimicking that of the butterfly's wings. So I'm going to also bring that down here as well. just onto the red section too. And I find often with a lot of wildlife images, the more you look, the more you see. One of the conversations I often have with people when they're in my art classes is knowing when to stop. It's quite tricky. But that's definitely down to, you know, how you feel with your image. It's your picture at the end of the day. The way you see colour and texture is different. So just do it how you want it to look. So we'll keep adding those little dots all the way through here. And you can see it's really adding to the texture and the detailing on that wing. Bring it into those red areas. So I'm going to bring it down where some of those kind of veins are. We drew a lot of these in when we did the ink work on the previous video. So feel free to go back to that if you missed a few sections. If you did miss a few sections with the ink work previously, don't panic. Let the watercolour dry and then you can use the ink over the top of the watercolour. So don't worry if you missed any areas out and you want to go back over it, you can, but just make sure that that watercolour is definitely dry first. So when I'm applying the paint with this brush, I'm literally just using the tip of the paintbrush. I'm not pressing too hard. And what you can do is, if you want to, is have a separate bit of paper to one side and just practice how much pressure to apply on your brush. Because sometimes if you press too heavy, you'll get obviously very large dots appearing on your painting and it might not look as delicate as you want it to. So just practice how much pressure to put on your brush when you're painting, and then when you're happy you can then obviously do your actual artwork and then apply the detailing. So I'm happy with that side. I'm now going to do the same over here. So I'm just going to, paint's starting to dry out a little, so I'm going to put a bit more water on there and start layering up those little dots on this side too. Start the side of the body here, and it just gives a little bit of a deeper tone to that ochre that we put in earlier on. And then I'm going to work back over the top of this wing here and just start to now introduce some more of those additional textures and little spots into the actual redness of the wing. And you can put in as much or as little as you want for this, it's entirely up to you. And if you want to, it could be a good point to pause the video and then just take your time with adding and building up those sections. There we go. Adds a lot more depth to the actual detailing on the butterfly. I do love my details, so being able to layer up the colour like this really enables you to add to that texture, gives you so much more depth in colour. There we go. And my colour's going a bit light over here, and that's simply because where I'm running out of the paint that's on the palette, every time I add water to it, it reduces the amount of pigment that's there. So I'm just adding a little bit more paint to my palette from the half pan. There we go. And that gives me a darker colour again. There we are. So if I want to go back over some of those areas and make a slightly darker spotty effect, you can. There we go, that's better, I'm happy with that. It's just added to that depth of colour. And now what you can do, because this area here next to the body has started to dry nicely, you can then go back over any other areas and put on another layer. So as you can see, a lot of my artwork is about building up layers of watercolour. And just add in those sections until you're happy with it, really. But the lovely thing is I don't wash my palette until the end of each of my tutorials or each of my paintings that I finish. So you've always got the colours there. So if when they dry, they've gone slightly darker or slightly lighter, you can always then come back to the colours on your palette and just add to it or change it. And it just helps you to enhance your picture even more. There we go. Yep, I'm happy with that now. So what I'm going to now do is start introducing colour into the main body of our butterfly here. And he's got some ochre and some of the darker brown and that in here as well. But I do want to obviously leave some areas where I can see that detail of the ink work coming through. So I'm going to start off with the yellow ochre. So I'm going to reactivate that colour that we were using earlier. I've switched over to the slightly bigger brush to do this. And to begin with, I'm going to just add in around the edge of his top section of his body here. I'm going to add in the lighter tones to begin with. And I'm going to do the same around the edge here on the base of his body. Just add in those ochre tones. And then there's a few areas of ochre that run through the centre here of his body as well. So we're going to bring them down a tone using the darker brown in a moment. But for now, I'm just going to map in those lighter sections. So you can see here, I've gone round the body and I've gone around this section here, which is like the kind of diamond shape that we drew in on the previous video. Just go round here on the edge of his body. And I've done some of the ochre around the centre section here as well. Now this area here, there's actually white sections underneath where the inkwork is. So I want to leave the white of the page to work in my favour and keep those areas light. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of ochre to the edge of his eyes as well. And again, we'll put some more dark browns in there in a moment. So that just adds those different tones and additional values of colour. So I'm going to wash off my brush. And I'm going to now introduce the darker brown. Alright, so this is your either burnt sienna or burnt umber. I use a burnt umber. I think it's quite a nice deep brown colour. So again, with the same brush, and I'm just going to now start to make those areas fractionally darker. So always refer back to your reference picture. And along the back section here is a darker shade of brown. So layering in those colours. I'm going to avoid this kind of V area here and this kind of diamond, but I do want a little bit of a darker tone along the bottom of that section. Like so. Now we're going to put even more detail in on this in a minute. And then this area here is a little darker. And I'm literally now just working my way through the reference picture. I'm constantly looking between my painting and the picture and just seeing what areas need to be darker and what areas need to stay that bit lighter. And then you work down onto the base of his tail and add in some of those darker tones into the base of his tail here. I'm going to just dab in some darker tones. around here, and just keep layering up those colours until you're happy with them. And put a tiny bit of the brown into here, not a huge amount because I don't want it to wash out that white section too much. And slightly darker, and then I just want to put a little bit of a darker brown onto the edge of those eyes as well, and the top section of his head. And now I'm going to wash my brush out, pop him to one side, and I'm going to switch over to the 3-0. Pick up that brown. I find as well, when you load up your brush, if you then press your brush down and twist it as you pull it out of the paint, what that then does is it pulls all your bristles together and makes it into a nice point, so you can get a really good crisp point then to your paintbrush. And I'm now going to just go around that edge with some very short brush strokes, and it will then start to pull out that brown into the ochre that we put around the edge. And you can see it's starting to give you a slightly more feathered effect rather than it being one colour and another colour. It's starting to blend the two together. And I'm going to do the same around the edge on here, just very short little brush strokes around that edge. Like so. And then I'm going to pick up some more of the dark brown, and with every layer you put over one another, the colour will naturally get darker. So because I have browns underneath it, every time I put another layer of brown, it's going to go a tone darker. And so rather than having to then mix darker colours to put over the top, you're literally just working with the colours you've got, but just in lots and lots of layers. And it gives you a really lovely effect with the watercolours. So I'm just breaking up those harsh edges on there. Now this area here looks quite stark, so what I'm going to do is just rinse my brush off, and I'm just going to grab a bit of watercolour from here and just pull it down onto that white. And what that's going to do is just going to mute the colour out slightly for you. I might just grab a tiny bit of ochre, I don't want too much on my brush. I'm just gonna, there we are, just take the edge off of that white. I may put a little bit of grey over the top of that later, so it's not quite so in your face, it's not quite so jumpy out at you. Yeah, that worked quite nicely. Just add a little bit of the dark brown to it, and I don't want to totally cover that white section, but I do want to mute it down a little bit because it just was popping out too much. So then along here on the front section of his face, we're going to make that a little bit darker. I'm sure there's lots of you amazing wildlife fans out there that are yelling at me right now going, that has a special name and it's this. Pop it in the comments if you do know what the special parts of the butterfly are called, because every day's a learning day. It's always good to learn something new. So I've just gone in there with the dark brown, and I've just put very, very gentle. So I've used the 3-0 brush, and I'm going to add a little bit of the brown along the edge here of the antennae at the front, just slightly, because the majority of the detail on this you've already put in using your ink pen. And then I'm going to put just a tiny little bit of the brown in the ends as well, just to lift it a little bit more. So as I said earlier on, you can always come back to some of these areas and layer up the colour more if you wish. So using that same colour palette that we've got here, I'm going to switch back over to the larger brush again, and I'm going to start introducing some of the brown around the edges of the wings. Now along here it looks like a bit like a zebra. I mentioned it in the previous video, but it does need a very slight bit of colouring behind it just to mute it down slightly. So what I've done here is I've used a little bit of ochre and a little bit of the yellow together. It's quite watered down. I don't want it to saturate the paper too much. And then I'm just going to pop a little bit along this edge here. Now, as I said, I don't want a huge amount. Just going to add a little bit, and the same on this side as well. And it'll just mute down the harshness of the black and white together. There we go. Might even introduce a little bit of the dark brown there. That's better. Just makes it a bit more like a shadow then. That looks better. And then along the edges here of the wings, all the way around, you've got like a kind of brown edge, and it blends into the white, and I'll show you how to do this. So we're going to use some of the dark brown, and I'm going to mix a little bit of ochre in with it, just to give it a slight yellowy mustard tinge. And you can see the colour's quite watered down. I don't want it too dark, so I put quite a lot of water in it. And then what I'm going to do is run it along the edge of this butterfly. Now on the reference picture there is like a sort of a very fine white line or edge along the edges of the actual wing, and when we did the ink work we did a line around the furthest edge, left a gap, and then did another little edge of ink. So you want to avoid that when you're painting in this brown section. So you want to paint it on the edge that's closest to the inside of the wing, if that makes sense. And I'm just going to go around the edge here like that, introduce some of that brown. You can go a little bit darker in sections if you want. This is the wet on dry technique again. So I'm going to go around this edge here. Just want a little bit brown around here. And slight more brown along that part. So follow what the picture tells me to do. How nature intended, as I often say. Do what nature intended. And then I'll carry on along this edge here. There we go. And again, if you want it to be slightly darker in places, you can then just load up your brush and just dab on where you want those more tonal areas to be. And because the paint that you've just painted on is wet, you're then doing wet on wet technique, and it means that the paint does all the hard work for you. So we'll carry on around this edge here. Right, so adding in those darker tones. And then if you want to go back over it at any point, you can just look back over, because sometimes you'll find, particularly if you've watered down the pigments a lot, you'll find that they'll dry quite a bit lighter than what they go on. So you may well want to go back over them a little, just to deepen those tones a little bit more, or those values, as they say. Okay, I'm just going to go back over here, just add a little bit more of depth of colour, and then I'll show you how to blend the brown into the white section. So you can see it easier here. You've got the brown edge, and then you've got the white section here. What we want to do is make this more blended. And what you can now do is clean off your brush like before, a bit like what we did here on the red into the yellow. Clean off your brush. You just want a damp brush and you want to reactivate that paint and just agitate that edge where the brown touches the white. And very gently you will then start to see how you can control and blend the watercolour into the white of the page, and it'll give you a lovely soft blended gradient between light and dark. Clean off my brush, take off the excess water, and then slowly but surely work your way around. And you can see how it reactivates the edge of that paint for you and really blends the paint into the white of the page. And rather than having to introduce white watercolour into your painting, which can be done, it's a lot easier if you can use the white of the page to your advantage, rather than having to then put white over the top of dark. It's very tricky to do. So you do have to think to yourself, okay, what areas are very light or white on the picture, and then use the white of your page to create that lighter section. So I'm just slowly working my way around. If it looks like my brush is getting a bit too dry, I then just load it back up with a little water. You don't want it to flood the page, so you do want to rub off any excess water that you've got. You just want your brush to be damp. And slowly but surely work your way around until you're happy with it. And you can see you've got a lovely gradient between your dark blue, your dark brown into your lighter sections there. And like we did before, where we did this technique and we blended those two, I've just slightly dampened my brush, and I want this red to gradually blend into the white. So like before, I'm going to now just with a damp brush go along this edge. It will soften the join between the two, and it will enable you to blend the red into the white of the page. So work on each section at a time where those two areas join. Clean your brush off in between if you need to remove what pigment you've now picked up on your brush. And very gently just work your way around each section until you're happy with the way in which it's blended together. And you can see you've got these lovely blended edges, but you've managed to keep control of the watercolour, which is why we build it up in lots of lovely layers. So it does take time, but it does enable you to control where your colours are going and what you want it to look like. So I want to make some of these edges around here that little bit deeper and darker, and some of them are black even. So I'm going to now introduce some black into my palette. I've got here an ivory black, but whatever black you've got, you just want it to, if you've only got one black in your palette, fine, but sometimes you'll find when you water it down it goes blue. I found with the ivory black and like sometimes the Mars black, it doesn't necessarily do that, but any black that you've got. Now the only thing to remember with black is quite a deep pigment, so you do want to kind of water it down a little bit to control how dark it goes on your page, and then you can build it up in layers. So it'll start off grey, and then the more layers you build up, the darker it'll go. So I'm just watering it down a little bit, just with a damp brush. I've switched back over to the number 2 brush on this, just so it's a bit quicker and easier to put the colour onto your palette. And now I'm going to go over to my 30. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of that paint that I've thinned down, so it looks like a kind of a light grey. And what I'm going to now do is just around the edge between the ink line that you previously put in and the brown edge, I'm just going to put in I'm just going to basically stipple, so just dabbing up and down some black areas on here, because I just want some of it to be slightly deeper in colour and get those values really jumping out of the page. And by doing this, it really makes the butterfly look like it's kind of jumping out at you a lot more. There we go. Just add in some more of that texture. There we go. And run it along this side as well. And put in as little or as much as you wish. Remember, this is always your painting at the end of the day. So build it up in layers however you wish to do it. There we go. And that I'm happier with. And you can see how it's just given it a lot more depth of colour to those areas. So I'm going to now work on some of these other sections of the wing that have got a lot more colour to them. We're going to need blue, we're going to need a pink, and we can use some of this bright yellow again as well. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in some of the blue sections. So I've got here quite a light blue, actually. This is like a cobalt blue, but remember, if you've got a very dark blue, like you might have a Prussian blue, for example, which is a very, very deep sort of navy blue, you can always add a little bit of white to it to make it a little bit lighter. So if you're finding that your colours are a little bit too dark, you can then lighten them that way. So, and the other way you can lighten them, so this one here at the minute, in accordance to the reference picture, is too dark. So if I pull a little bit of that paint to one side, water it down, see how it's given me a lighter blue? And this is the tone of blue that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to use the number 2 brush because I don't need to put too much detailing on where I put the blue, and you just want to follow your reference picture as to where it goes. So this is your black section here, which we actually started putting some detailing on with the ink pen, and then just in front of it is where the blue area is. So I'm going to pop in the light blue. Now remember, a bit like when we did with the red, start off a bit more pale in colour to begin with, and then you can always go back over it and make it darker or a bit more vibrant. The other area that is blue is inside this pattern section here. I always think they look a bit like eyes. And then there's a little bit of blue on this section here too. And then the same on this side, because they're kind of mirrored. So we've got the blue on the inside of this eye, and on that little section, and then you've got the black section here, and just on this side of it you've got the blue area. So I'm just adding that in. And now I'm going to go back over the top of some of the areas on this side, because this side has started to dry. So what I'm going to now do is switch over to the 30 brush, and I'm going to go into the original slightly darker blue this time, because I'm going to use that stippling technique just add in some more texture and detailing onto those blue areas. Now if your paint's very, very wet and you want it to dry between, do. But I'm going to just go over the top just in a few areas, not over the whole thing, just a few areas. Again, looking at that reference picture and deciding, okay, this bit here is a little bit of a darker blue, so I'm going to add that stippled effect just to make the colour a little bit more intense. Add that into here as well. Like so. And then I'll put a little bit more in there, actually that's better, I'm happy with that. And then I'm going to put a little bit in here too, just a few dots, very small. Again, just using the tip of your brush and just layer up those little dots. There we go, until you're happy with it. And again, like I said before, when it dries, you can always come back to it later and add more to it if you wish. I'm quite happy with that at the moment. So I'm now going to add in some of the pink sections. So on the reference picture, we've got some areas on each side here, and then also around the edge of this section here is like a pinky colour. So to do that, I'm going to use a little bit of the Cadmium Red that we had earlier. I'm just going to put it to one side. And even though it's thinned down, it's still a bit too bright. So what I'm going to do is just use a little bit of white watercolour. There we go, mix that in with the red and you should get a nice baby pink colour. That's it. Alter it down a little bit. And then again, using that reference picture to know where it goes, you can start putting in, oh that's gone a bit too bright, so I'm going to put a little bit more red into it. It was a bit too pale, I mean, that's better. Make it a little bit darker. And it runs along the edge here, around this section here, just up under the red section here, and then around here, and then there's some pink around this edge here, like so. And then on this side we've got the pink on that little section again, and around this section on the top of the kind of eye detailing. And then just avoid those white sections that are on your reference picture, so you can use the white of the page to create those lighter areas, like so. Clean off my brush. I think that's the only red, the only pink sections. And then what I'm going to do is switch over to my 3-0 brush. I'm going to mix in a tiny bit more of the Cadmium Red into that pink, just to make it a little bit deeper. And then the same stippling effect like we did before, just to give it a little bit more texture and depth to those areas, so they're not just a flat colour. Just going to add in a few little dots here and there, not a huge amount, but just to break it up a little. And it just give it a little bit more detail in those areas for you. Hopefully you're enjoying it so far. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and then I can also do lots more videos for you to follow along, and pop some comments on there as well. Share your pictures with me, because I love to see what you're doing, but it also enables me to then know what kind of videos you'd like me to make. So do let me know. It really does help if you're sharing my channel and that out there to others. It really helps my artwork to be seen, and also for other people to enjoy painting along with us. So yeah, please do share, please do share. So I now need to put in a few more brown tones around this section here on the wing. So what I'm going to do for that is I've gone back over to the burnt umber. I've just filled it up on my palette because I was running out. You might not have been. I'm just thinning it down so we get a slightly lighter tone. Switched over to the 30 brush. And I want to run some of that brown around this edge here. And around this edge here. And the two do meet on this section here. And then the same technique that we did before, I'm going to use the 30 this time. So I've washed my brush off, and just with a very slightly damp brush, I'm going to agitate where that brown touches the white. And you can see how it's starting to blend the brown into the white for me. And give me a nice blended soft edge between the two areas. And then I'm going to do the same on this area here as well. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of that burnt umber, paint it on this section here, bring it down the side, run it along the top here, clean off my brush, and just with a damp brush, I'm going to agitate that edge and blend the brown into the white. And then just keep working on it until you're happy with it, basically. There we go. So what we're going to now do is introduce some of the yellow sections on here. So we've got some yellow around here, we've got a bit of yellow across the top here, and then the same on this side too. So I'm going to use that nice bright yellow that we had earlier on. This was what we were using when we were doing this section around here on the body. So I've just grabbed a little bit of the yellow, and we need a touch on this side of the wing detailing here. We need some round here. Now luckily I left pencil marks on here so I knew where the sections were, but don't panic if you don't know where they are, or if you want to draw them in again with a pencil before you then add the watercolour, you can, and then when the watercolour's totally dried you can rub the pencil marks off so you won't see them. So I'm going to then go over this side. So we've got a little bit of yellow here. We want to leave some white at the top. And then we've got a little bit of yellow here. And we've got some yellow happening around here as well. And there's a tiny bit of yellow on that side too. And again, what I'm going to do this time is put a little bit of ochre into the yellow, make it a bit of a deeper tone. And then I'm going to stipple just a little bit of detailing into them sections. And the other thing I'm going to do as well is I'm going to do the technique where we blend the two colours together. So clean off your brush just with a damp brush. Go between the red and the yellow just enough to activate that colour. and blend them both together so you haven't got like a big harsh line between the two sections. Like so. There we go. So now what we need to do is we need to introduce some of the red into these areas of the eyes. So go back to that cadmium red that we used when we were doing this section on the wing. And there's an area here in the middle of the eye on each side that has got this red section. So I'm just picking up some of that red and I'm going to gently start introducing that into this side of the wing. There we go. And use that stippling technique just to draw out some of the red whilst we're there. I'm going to go with a slightly deeper tone of red as well in a moment, so we can make that values of the red a lot deeper. So slowly but surely work out, and just use your reference picture and take your time and just look at exactly where that red section needs to go. Like so. There we go. Now this side here is drying really nicely, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a tiny bit of this black and add it to the red, and it should give us a nice deep red kind of colour. There we go. And then I'm going to just, with my stippling technique, just with the tip of your brush, and I'm just going to add a little bit into the eye of that red section, so you can still see that there's some of the red from the first sort of layer that we put on. We're just going to go over it with a slightly deeper tone just to give it a little bit more depth of colour, and then you can bring it out onto that white section a little if you wish, just to give it a little bit more depth and break up some of those harsh areas that we previously painted. And you see like this white section here looks quite flat as well, so by just introducing a little bit of the surrounding colour to that, we're not covering up the white at all, but it does break it up from being just a big stark white section. And I think we're ready to now add the final black detailing. So we've got the black on our palette already. I'm going to thin it down a little because I want it to go sort of a little bit transparent, which is a lovely thing you can do with watercolours, because I can then also see if it goes on in layers of grey to begin with, you can make sure you're getting it in the right spot, but also you can then see your ink work coming through, so you won't lose all that detail that you've done. So I'm going to start over here to begin with, and this area we did put in a lot of the section with ink, so you can literally just paint over the top of where you did the ink work, and we're going to put that black section around the edge here. So now I know I'm happy with where it is. I'm going to then go back over the top of it with another layer of black just to intensify that colour. But I'm going to leave some of the grey popping through, and it'll then enable it to give it a bit more depth and interest. I'm going to then put in this section here on the top of the eye as well, because there's like a dark black section to here too. There we go. Add a little bit more to intensify the colour. We've then got this section along here. Now you can just paint it in basically. It's kind of filling in the gaps because when you did the ink work on the previous video, you actually outlined where this particular detail is on the butterfly's wing. So you can literally just follow your outline that you've already drawn and just fill in the colours. So that should be pretty much where that goes. So now I'm happy with it. I'm going to run along this top edge and I'm going to leave a little bit of gap of grey between the two areas. And it'll just give it a little bit more interest than it just being flat black. And just stipple in that colour. And layer it in like so. And if you want to then just take a view, you look at the detailing on the design. I'm just going to bring some of that black out slightly, so it's not a heavy line. And then we've got this section here which is also black, so I'm going to basically fill it in where you drawn the outline earlier. And then I'm going to put a few little extra sections, little dots around the outside edge here. And then work our way down. So we've got this section here around the blue is also black. So I'm going to add in that, and I'm going to use the stippling effect just so we don't end up with big heavy harsh lines around the sections. It just looks more like the pattern is on the actual butterfly wing. So just add that paint on layer by layer until you're happy with how it looks. Keep looking at that reference picture as well, just to make sure that you've painted it in the right section. Make sure you're putting those colours in the right spots, quite literally. And then we've got this section here, which is that darker area as well. So again, I'm going to stipple it in bit by bit, layer in that colour. Slowly fill that section. I'm going to bring some of those little dots out slightly, just so it blends into the body a little bit more. Looks a bit more like the reference picture then. And then we're going to do the same over this side here. So I'm going to work on this bit here first, so we can stipple in the black. Along here, and then I'm going to work on this big section here. So I'm going to first of all just fill it with the colour. So it's going on like a kind of grey colour to begin with because it's a bit watered down. Like so. And then pick up a bit more of the pigment, and like we did before, so we stippled along the top edge first, left a gap of the grey, stippled along underneath with the black, and then now if you're starting to run out of paint on your palette, feel free to load it up again. I'm just going to keep layering it up with the stipples. There we go. Just feather that edge a little bit, make it look more realistic. You can keep layering up that black, and every time you put another layer on, it will just intensify the dark shade. I'm just going to do the same over here. I'm just going to, because now this is drying, you can see more the actual colour it's going to look when it's finished. Now I'm running out of black, so I'm going to fill mine up. There we go. So dip back in, grab some of that paint again. I'm just going to bob back over to this section here because it's drying nicely now, but I just want to make it a little bit more intense in colour. Same on this bit here. So if you're happy with how yours looks, that's fine, just leave it as it is. But if you do feel you need to come back to any sections to make them a little bit darker, you can. So onto this eye section here, so you've got this darker area at the top here. So again, we kind of put a lot of the detailing in with the ink. Now if you found that the ink actually was enough and you don't need to go over it with the paint, just leave it as it is. But if you do want to go back over it, you can. And then you've got this section around here, around the edge. So I just want to make it darker than what it is with the ink. So I'm just going to work over the top. Like so. There we go. And you can add a few other little, there's a few little darker sections here and there. So like I said before, when you look at the reference picture, sometimes the more you look, the more you see. And when you see it, pop it in. So that's that area, and then we've got these sections here. So we've got this sort of triangle sort of shape here. So I'm going to stipple in that section. Like so. And then we've got the area here around the blue. Stipple in that section around there. Get your shape where you're happy with it. And now we've got most of the sections in. I think it's all pretty much coming together nicely. So I'm just going to now go through. So I feel this area here is just a little bit too harsh. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to water down some of this black. So I've got a sort of light grey. And you can use a bit of artistic license sometimes if you want to. I'm just going to run some of that grey along that top edge on there. It's just going to break up some of the white, and it'll just mute it down a little bit, tone it down from being too vibrant. That looks a bit better. And I'm going to do the same just along the top edge here of this section, and just bring it into the white a little. I just think it looks a little bit too, bright to me in comparison to the actual reference picture. Just going to pop a few little dots of grey just along there, just to finish it off There we go. I feel pretty happy with that, to be honest. I think what I might just do is make some of the centre of the body here a little darker. So I'm just going to use some of the watered down black and just gently just put a few stipples of it. I don't want to overpower it. Now you might find that you're happy with how dark your one looks, so you might not need to do this. I just want to make some of these sections a little bit more vibrant and highlighted, so I'm just going to go over it with some of the darker colour or some of the black, just to bring out some of those shadows. Like so. And sometimes I do find when you're painting as well, sometimes it helps to kind of step away from it or have a break from it and then come back again and then look at it with what I call fresh eyes. And then you might notice that some of it isn't quite how you remembered, or it might be that your colours have dried a little bit different to how they went on when they were wet, so you might want to make them slightly darker. And then just keep working on it until you're happy with it, really. I think the only finishing touch that I would do now actually is where these lines are on the red of the wing. Because the red's so vibrant, it's kind of muted those pen marks quite a lot. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit of black in with the red. And I'm just going to go over the top. I'm going to put a little bit of brown in there as well, just to, that's better. I'm happier with that colour tone. Looks a bit more like the reference picture. And just with my fine brush, my 3-0, I'm just going to go over some of those areas. Now, if you're happy with your ink lines on this, don't worry, leave it as it is. I'll make that a bit darker. It's not coming out dark enough for my liking. That's better. So I put a little bit more brown and a little bit more black in because mine wasn't quite dark enough. That's a little bit better. And I'm just going to go over these lines here, just where the red section is, just to intensify those areas a little bit. Hopefully you can kind of see the difference between this side and that side. See how it's just made that area a little bit more defined? So I'm going to do the same one here. And the same one here. Now you will sometimes find that the colours will dry slightly darker. So again, start a bit lighter in tone and then you can always go back over them again later if you need to make them a bit darker. There we go. Just define those lines. I'm a bit happier with those. I think they look a lot nicer. They're kind of jumping out at you a little bit more like the reference picture is. And I'm quite happy with that. Hopefully you're happy with your one too. Don't forget to share it with me. Send me a picture, drop me a comment. If you want to ask any questions, please do. Please share my videos. Please like and subscribe. Hit the notification button because, as I said, the more people that I can get seeing my videos, the more I can then make, and tell me what you'd like me to paint, and then I can also customize them as well. So if it's something in particular that you'd really like me to help you paint in watercolours, then drop me a message. Subscribe to my channel, and hopefully we can all join one another again soon to do some more watercolour painting together. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it, and yeah, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care.